How's it going, Eliminators? Today we're going to be replacing a sump gasket and a crankshaft main seal on a Kawasaki FC540V engine that came off of that John Deere 325 riding lawnmower. So let's get right into it. So in the previous video that I did, we pulled off the engine from this John Deere 325. If you missed that video, you can click the link in the top right of your screen. As for the engine here, because I didn't remove the oil filter, I'm doing that now, and I just have a small aluminum tray to catch any oil that does come out. I'm going to be threading on a new oil filter just to keep this area clean so that debris doesn't go in there. And then when this engine's reinstalled, before I go and fire it up, I will unthread this, fill it with a little bit of oil to, quote, prime the oil filter, and then I'll rethread it on and tighten it up so that when I do go to fire up this engine, there will be oil already in the filter and it won't be running dry. So first up, this little plastic shroud has to come off, and I've removed the 8mm bolts. The last one here has this little tab on there, so you're going to have to remember that. That is to hold your battery positive cable going to your starter solenoid. You notice how the dipstick is sticking out slightly above the rest of the top of the engine. So for me not to snap that in half, I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to remove this bolt, and we're going to loosen that dipstick and remove it. And because I don't want anything going inside of the bottom end, even though we're going to be pulling that sump pan off, I've just taken a little rag and stuffed it into the dipstick hole. And next up, I'm just removing this little guard here, and that will allow me to flip the engine over without bending that, because that does spin with the flywheel. So this table, as good as it is, it's a little low and I have to work on it with a smaller stool. So I have upgraded. I have this table here that I used to have my walnut shell blasting cabinet on, and I have the engine flipped upside down. You guys can see it here. Now this does have a 1/4-inch piece of wood on it with a hole drilled in the center, and I've already drilled out my holes. I'll show you that later. But right now I just have a towel over it so that I have the engine upside down. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this hole here for the exhaust port, because I don't want anything to go in there. You can also see that I have a small gas tank here on a post with a fuel line and a shutoff valve. That's just for testing engines. So if I ever wanted to test an engine, I can bolt it to this table, hook up my fuel line, I can have a little battery and hook that up as well and test the engine. So now I'm at the point where I'm kind of just having a look around on this engine. Check this out. We have a little bit of oil, so that's wet with oil. But if I have a little closer inspection, I can see that there's all kinds of oil right there. So that right there is where our sump gasket is leaking. So I'm assuming that the gasket just blew out in that little section there, then that oil all went around. And I just assumed that it was the crankshaft main seal, which we can see looks okay. It is slightly wet, but it doesn't look as bad as I thought. But if you're gonna pull a sump pan to replace a sump gasket, you absolutely should replace the crankshaft main seal. You're there, and for an extra like $5 or $6 that seal is gonna cost you, go ahead and do it. So now the question is, how do you remove this? So we're gonna start by removing these 4 bolts here. There's gonna be a bolt over here. There's gonna be one right there, one right up here. There's gonna be one in a hole right there, and there's gonna be another one in there. And I'm just using a 12mm socket on my impact. So I've got all my bolts out. We're gonna come down here and I've kind of laid them out, and you're gonna notice right away that one bolt is shorter than the other. So the short bolt is gonna go right there. So now that I'm ready to split the case, as they say, I have my little putty knife there, and I'm gonna be using that to just go around and separate the gasket. But first, I'm gonna be using a soft blow hammer here, and I'm just gonna come up to where the oil pump is, and I'm just gonna give it a light tap. And we're gonna see that right away it is starting to split the case. So now I can go around with my putty knife and just make sure that the gasket is separated all the way around. However, before we go ahead and pull off the sump, you're gonna wanna check to see if your crankshaft has your key in it. So this has a keyway, and there is a key in it. So I'm gonna just use a hammer and a little chisel, and I'm just gonna pop that out. Now I'm just holding the oil pump and the drain tube, and I got lucky with this one, guys, because we can see that this one slid right off. So here's the sump. These gears are for your oil pump and your governor, and they look like they're in excellent condition. The main thing here is that when I removed this sump, a little washer fell. And this washer is called a thrust washer, and that goes right there. So that sets your crankshaft end play, so the amount that your flywheel will lift up and down once your engine is assembled. Now I can actually adjust crankshaft end play by putting either a thicker or thinner sump gasket on, because we have to remember that A thicker gasket will allow for more crankshaft end play, and a thinner gasket will give us less play because this will be tighter on the engine, compressing the crankshaft even tighter on the engine block. But talking about crankshaft end play and measuring it is a little bit more in depth. Right now, I'm just going to be replacing this gasket. It's blown out in a couple spots. So essentially what I'm going to do is just go around and scrape off this gasket because I want it to be as clean as possible. I don't want any gunk there. I'm also going to take this opportunity to rinse this out. So all of this nasty stuff in the bottom of this sump that has accumulated over the years, I'm gonna wipe all that out. Now this process here can be time consuming depending on if your gasket just simply peels off. You can see that this section removed nicely, but up here, because the gasket was so compressed, I'm having to take an X-Acto knife and I'm gonna go in and try to cut as best I can underneath it. Just make sure that you're not going to score the aluminum because aluminum is soft, and you want to try and keep this surface as flat as possible so that the gasket mating surface is going to be nice and smooth. So sometimes you guys are going to have to fight with it, and other times you're going to get lucky and it's going to come off in a big chunk. And I'm going to try my best not to be getting debris in anywhere near the oil pump or its pickup. Now, speaking of the oil pump itself, there is going to be an oil pump screen, and that's going to keep debris out of your oil pump. And that's going to be either clean or a lot worse depending on how often you change your oil. Because it had a leak, some of it leaked out and my customer replaced it. So assuming that there was always clean, fresh oil in this machine, that screen isn't that bad. Now I'm going to be cleaning that off, but you guys want to make sure that that screen is clean, because I've seen engines actually grenade themselves because the oil pickup screen was so clogged with sludge that no oil went into the oil pump, which made the oil pump essentially ineffective. And because the oil pump wasn't pumping oil, there was no oil going to the crankshaft, and the crankshaft ended up seizing, snapped the connecting rod, complete catastrophic engine failure. So while you have this off, it's an excellent time to go in there and just clean that up. And I should note that that little screen is replaceable, so I'll put a part number for that in the description down below if you guys need to replace it. And while I'm cleaning off this gasket, it's a good little time to explain how a governor works. So as your engine is spinning, your crankshaft spin this gear for your oil pump, which in turn spins this little plastic gear. So as engine RPM increases, these counterweights push out farther, which in turn lifts that post farther up. And looking at our engine, we can see that our oil pump gear connects to our crankshaft gear. That little post there presses up against the governor arm. So as engine RPM increases, those counterweights come out, pushing that post up. That post presses up against the arm. That arm goes back to your governor arm on the outside of your machine, which connects to obviously a spring and a rod that goes back to your carburetor. So if you have an engine that you fire it up and the thing just winds right out, chances are you have a stripped governor gear. And these things are pretty simple. You're just going to pull that off, replace your plastic gear, and put them back on. So after a little bit of time, I have all the gasket material off of our oil sump pan here. But the thing is, the oil pan itself is still dirty. There's old oil and grease all over it. So I'm going to be cleaning this. I'm going to be wiping the outside down. Now, as for the oil filter pickup here, you guys might think that there is a gasket there, but there actually isn't. So I'm going to pull this off because I want to make absolutely sure that there is no leak. It is 3 bolts. Right there. So basically what you're going to do is just come up to the top here and you're just going to look down, and as long as your O-rings here are thicker than the aluminum surface, then they will make a good seal. So if they've been compressed, then you're going to want to go ahead and change them. But I'm just going to go in here and just clean that up, make sure there's no gunk in there, and then I'll go ahead and tighten that back up. I'm also going to be using a little bit of Blue Permatex Threadlocker on all the bolts that I put in, and that will just ensure that none of these bolts are going to vibrate loose. And you're going to be torquing those bolts to approximately 54 inch-pounds. Okay, so I got my sump pan flipped over now, and I'm removing the crankshaft main seal. So I'm coming in with a set of cutters here, and I'm going to go in, careful not to damage the aluminum, but basically I'm just going to go in and I'm just going to start to rotate it, and as you keep working it, you will break it free just like that. So now our crankshaft main seal is out. And we can also see here that someone has put some RTV gasket maker, all that orange stuff on there. That's not good. So this thing could have been leaking for a while, and instead of just going ahead and replacing that, somebody just put some gasket maker in there and tried to stop the leak, but that won't stop it, guys. That'll just slow it down. So as we can see, this thing's completely dirty, like it's super dirty. So what I plan on doing is wiping this all down and getting as clean as possible. If you wanted to wash it with like a hose or something, you're going to have to try to prevent water from going into your oil pump area. So in the meantime, I've taken my thrust washer here, I've wiped it down, and I've put it onto my crankshaft right there. So that means we're not going to lose it, and when I go to put my sump pan back on, I won't have to worry about it falling in. It's there and it's good to go. Next up, I'm going to go and do the same thing, just cut away any gasket material that's on this surface, and then I'll be ready to lay my new gasket down. So I have the engine all cleaned up for the gasket surface here. It is by far the most time-consuming process, and when it comes to the engine side, you want to be as meticulous as possible, because I don't plan on removing any of the internal components like the camshaft or the crankshaft itself, which means I'm trying to limit the amount of debris going inside of the engine. I've done a pretty good job. You guys can see that there's not a whole bunch of crud, and everything looks to be fairly clean in there. I've done a pretty good job at keeping debris out. I've pulled out my little rag there. It's oil soaked now, but that'll allow me to get in here. I'm gonna go around and just clean up this edge. We can see that somebody has taken some gasket maker and RTV siliconed wherever it was leaking before. So this sump could have been off before, and somebody just slapped on some RTV silicone and then cranked it back on, and did the same thing with the main seal just as a quick fix. But I mean, if you take the time to pull everything off, why wouldn't you just replace it with new components? Like I said, for a few bucks in gaskets, you're gonna have a guarantee. So I'm just gonna be using an abrasive disc here. This is a soft abrasive disc that will not harm the aluminum. It will only take off the gunk. So I'm just gonna hit that real quick, and I'm gonna keep it so that my disc is spinning away from the center of the engine. And I'm just gonna lightly go along this surface and remove some of that material. And you guys can see what a good job that does. It will not remove any of the aluminum. It just takes away some of that gunk. So I'm gonna hit any other areas that I think I should hit, and then we'll go ahead and lay our gasket on. So you guys can see I have a big chunk of cardboard here, and that is their part number there for our sump gasket. So they ship it in a piece of cardboard so that it doesn't distort. Awesome. And here's our crankshaft main seal. So there's your John Deere part number. Again, all the part numbers will be in the description down below. So I'm gonna open this up. This is official John Deere cardboard. I can't believe it. This is pretty much a collector's item. I mean, honestly, guys, who does this? Like, why would you even do that? I know it makes it nice for presentation, but, somebody has to make this. They have to pay to put their logo onto a piece of cardboard and then cut it with rounded edges. And I mean, like, how silly. They could just use a normal piece of cardboard. So anyways, that's my rant about John Deere cardboard. Here's what you've been wanting to see. So this is a genuine part, made in Japan. There's your Kawasaki gasket number. So I've cleaned out my sump pan here, and what I did was I used degreaser and water. So I'm gonna leave this in front of my furnace. It's got a blower fan on it, and basically I'll just let the warm air evaporate all the water, because what you don't want is water in your oil pump. When you go to put your engine back together, that water is going to create foam inside of your oil, and that will actually suspend itself on top of your crankshaft and camshaft, things like that, and it won't lubricate properly. You're going to wait a night, let it thoroughly dry. So I'm ready now to install my new oil seal into the sump pan. And to do that, I'm going to be using what's known as a bearing, race, and seal driver. So essentially these just have little pucks. They're machined to different sizes. I have a little kit here. And this was cheap. I bought it at Princess Auto, I believe. And basically, you just get your seal and you line it up to the little driver here. And you just make sure that you have one that fits close, because you don't want one smaller. Because if you use one that's smaller, you could end up damaging the actual section where the seal makes contact with the crankshaft. And if you rip or tear that little edge, because it's a lot thinner than you would think, you could end up having an oil leak. So basically, we're going to be putting this little ring side down, so your flat side there is up. So what I'm going to do is use a little bit of 3-in-1 oil, and I'm going to lubricate the outer edge of this. I'm going to, again, put it ring side down. I'm going to lay it down, and I'm going to try to get it as flat as possible first, and then I'm going to go in with my bearing driver. I'm going to line it up, and using just a soft blow hammer, I'm going to tap it, and then we're going to check it, and I'm going to make sure that I'm as level as possible, because what you don't want to do is drive in one side and then try to force in the other side, because we have to remember that this is slightly larger than the hole that you're putting it into, and that's what kind of compresses it to make that tight seal so that you don't leak oil. So again, a little bit of 3-in-1 oil, and all that does is just help it slide in a little easier so that you're not pinching any of the rubber on the seal itself. With a little bit of oil on your finger, go in there and run it around the edge here so that that isn't dry either. I'm going to try to center up my seal driver as best as possible, and I'm just giving it light little taps. Now it looks like we got to come down on this side a little more, and it's looking pretty level to me. It would be easier if this base was level, and we can hear that we're starting to bottom out. So if we have a look here, I can see that I'm bottomed out on this side, but I'm slightly high on that edge. We can have a look here, and you guys can see. So all I'm going to do is put my seal driver on here, and then I'll probably give this end a tap with my soft blow mallet, and that should level me off. And the benefits of using a seal driver that's slightly larger than the diameter of the seal is you'll know when the aluminum of the seal driver is contacting the aluminum of the sump. So a little bit more on that edge, and we should be good. So we can see now that my seal is completely leveled off. So that's perfect. That's ready to go back onto the machine. So when I do go ahead to install it, I'm gonna take a little bit of oil and wrap it around this edge here, and that'll ensure that there's no tearing on that light surface here. Because if I can get a shot of this, there is a very small edge there. See that? And it's very delicate, and that's what seals against your crankshaft. That's in there tight now. Now if you don't have one of these seal driving kits, then don't worry, you can use a little redneck ingenuity. So what I have here is just a piece of PVC pipe, and you guys can see that this is for like tubing to go over, but the big thing here is the diameter and the thickness of the wall. So essentially you can get one of these, and you guys can see that I have used this in the past. So this was the old technique before I bought this little kit here. And by the way, these things are totally worth the money because they're just awesome. I use them all the time, and if you're doing seals all the time, then you should have one because you're going to use it, and it will prevent you from having to go and buy another seal. If you damage it, which brings me back to this, it also has less of a contact surface, which means when you hammer on this end, it's putting all that force on this small ring, whereas with these, when you hammer on it, it's putting force on the full surface of your seal. So essentially is if you use one of these, you could damage a seal. So what I would recommend is go ahead and buy a couple seals. But again, you know, this is the old-fashioned way. That's the best way to do it. So I have my gasket in place now, and I've lined it up to all of the little studs that come out of the crank here, and that's just to line up your pan when you're putting it on. So John Deere recommends to put this gasket on dry, so you don't want to be using any RTV silicone to, you know, help seal things up. John Deere recommends you run it dry, so that's what we're going to be doing. I've also taken a little bit of lube and put it over the crankshaft just to help things slide a little bit easier. Now you're going to get to a point where your sump kind of gets hung up like this, and that's because your gears aren't going to be meshing. So we're going to have to mesh the oil pump gear with the crankshaft gear. So what we're going to do is lightly kind of wiggle that, and if we have to, we're going to turn the crankshaft, and that should drop down. Now you're going to want to know where to tap with your rubber mallet so that you don't damage anything, and I'm going to show you. So if we have a look up inside the engine, we can see that the camshaft, which is right here, goes up inside of a little post in the sump cover here. So that spot is right about there. So you'll be able to tap in that location without damaging anything. You're also going to be able to tap around the crankshaft itself, but you're going to have to look in from the other side. And once you start getting close to the point where your oil pump gear right there is starting to mesh with your crankshaft gear, you're going to want to slow things down and start going by hand. So by giving this just the slightest tap in the right spot, we're going to see that we're starting to drop down. Now you'll notice there's still a gap here, and we're getting to the point where the gears are starting to mesh, so you're going to want to go carefully. Now you may remember a term that I used earlier in the video called crankshaft end play, and basically what that is just the amount of distance your crankshaft here travels up and down when your sump is bolted to your engine. So once you get to the point where there's that little gap, all you're going to do, if you have your engine upside down like I do, is I just went and placed my little wheel chuck underneath here so that the flywheel isn't under the pressure of the engine. So just from the weight of that engine pushing down, the crankshaft will be pushed up, and it will actually be pushed up high enough to the point where you might not be able to make a tight seal with your sump to your crankcase. So by having it flipped up ever so slightly, it takes a little bit of pressure off of that flywheel, which then helps drop the crankshaft ever so slightly, allowing us to close that gap. So I'm now ready to go ahead and put my bolts in. Now before I go to put my crankcase bolts back in, I'm going to be cleaning them up on my wire wheel here. I'm just going to be using a little bit of Blue Permatex Threadlocker to help them seal and prevent them from backing out in the future. So I'm just going to snug these up using my drill. And then I'm going to be torquing these bolts to 19 foot-pounds or 230 inch-pounds. But what I'm going to do is a staggered torque, so I'm going to just go kind of one by one, and I'm just going to keep going across until I get all of them torqued. And you can hear the click. So our crankcase cover, or commonly referred to as a sump pan, is now installed and fully torqued. So that's it for today's video, guys. We were able to replace not only the sump gasket, but also the crankshaft main seal. And just as a note, before I go to install this engine, I'm gonna let it sit with some oil in it to make sure that it does not leak before I go ahead and install the engine. And that'll just prevent me from having to take the engine out again if there are any small leaks. But if you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to stop on by next week to check out new content. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.